The violation notice was taped to the mailbox like a scarlet letter, accusing an 11-year-old of wandering off-trail. The morning light filtered through the birch trees, painting thin stripes of gold across the gravel drive. A sharp wind carried the scent of pine, cold air clinging to chimney smoke still lingering from the night before. Jacob Reeves stood in his thick wool socks, cradling a chipped mug in both hands, letting the steam rise into his lined face. The porch creaked under his weight, familiar as an old friend, as he stared at the garish orange slip. It fluttered slightly. Someone had made sure it stuck, but just loose enough to catch the breeze and announce itself. $250 fine. Unauthorized trail deviation. Jacob didn't touch it. He simply turned, walked back inside, and reached for his coffee pot. Ben was already in the kitchen, hunched over the island with a laptop open and brows furrowed. His pour-over setup steamed beside him, and he barely looked up when Jacob stepped in. "They cited Ethan," Ben said flatly. "Said he wandered 10 feet off the community trail. A volunteer patrol took a photo." Jacob took a breath and sipped. What was he doing? "Looking at moss, I guess." Ben's voice cracked with disbelief. "He was with 2 other kids. They didn't get fined." "Because they're on the committee's roster," Gloria chimed in from the mudroom doorway. She carried a loaf of pumpkin bread wrapped in linen and a knowing look. "Karen's been trying to tighten trail control ever since the September vote failed." Ben rubbed his forehead. "She said it was about safety. We're talking about a kid and some moss." Jacob took the bread with a gentle nod to Gloria and placed it on the counter. He glanced out the window toward the tree-line. "Do we still have the original trail map?" Ben hesitated. "I found one from 2005, but they've updated it. Digitally. HOA maps only go back 5 years now." Jacob nodded slowly. "I'll check the shed." That afternoon, the HOA convened in the community center, a squat building with beige siding and scuffed linoleum floors. Folding chairs lined the room, half filled with neighbors murmuring over reusable mugs and early-season scarves. At the front stood Tom Wallace, shoulders hunched in his blazer, and Karen Holbrook, crisp and composed in a tailored burgundy jacket. Karen tapped the podium. "Trail rules are not arbitrary. We've had 2 close calls this year alone. Boundaries matter." Ben shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Ethan sat beside him, small and unsure, twisting a zipper pull between his fingers. Jacob sat in the back row, arms folded, silent. Karen continued. "Deviation, even minor, endangers both the land and our liability. We cannot make exceptions." No one stood to argue. Tom offered a watery smile and adjourned. People filtered out polite nods and muted glances. No one spoke to the Reeves. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Jacob stepped off the porch and made his way past the old tool shed. The trail markers were newer now, reflective strips nailed to trees and small signs reminding hikers to stay aligned. He walked past them without pause, deeper into the woods where the air grew still. He stopped at the base of a sugar pine whose lower trunk bore a faint scar, smoothed by time. Beneath the dry needles and half-buried roots, he found the rusted outline of the box. "Still here," he murmured. Back inside, the steel was cool against his palms as he placed it on the kitchen table. The latch was stiff, but a small brass key from his keyring still fit the lock. It clicked open with a reluctant sigh. Inside were old topo maps, folded and marked with red grease pencil, dates running along the margins. Trail permits, a Forest Service badge. A yellowed deed from 1978, signed in his father's hand. Everything laid carefully over 40 years ago, waiting. He heard the kettle click off. Ben returned from brushing leaves off the back porch, eyes falling to the documents spread like a mosaic of memory and intent. Jacob didn't speak right away. He laid them out on the kitchen table. "Let's see what they forgot to check." Karen's new rule required foot traffic logs. Jacob had never once signed a trail ledger in his life. The morning mist drifted low between the trees, carrying the chill of a deeper autumn. Frosted pines, quiet as ever, stirred slowly. Gloria's barn had begun to hum with early voices, the scent of pot roast and cinnamon cider reaching the gravel road like a whispered invitation. Folding chairs creaked beneath neighbors with stiff backs and warmer eyes, bundled in flannel and fleece. A long table bore bowls of roasted vegetables, apple slices dusted with nutmeg, and one proud crockpot labeled Delaney family beans, no onions this year. Jacob sat near the back corner, nursing coffee from a heavy mug with the faded logo of the Forest Service still etched along its side. Across from him, Ben watched Ethan chase leaves with two other boys near the edge of the pasture. The laughter was muffled by fog, but the joy was clear. Karen stood at the head of the barn beside Tom, her posture straight, a clipboard tucked neatly against her side. In light of recent incidents, she said, voice firm but saccharine, we are initiating a foot traffic record policy. All trail users must sign in and out. A few neighbors shifted in their seats. Sheriff Cole raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Gloria leaned toward Jacob, whispering, she really is the queen of laminated rules. Her smirk faded quickly. Watch how fast they stop calling it a community trail. Later, while the cider cooled and conversations thinned into soft laughter and scraped plates, Jacob excused himself with a nod and wandered toward the tree line behind the barn. The woods welcomed him like an old song, the hush of leaves, the rhythm of boots over loam. He passed the newer signs, bold red text and fresh bolts, and continued deeper. Near the old ravine, he stopped. A sugar pine rose wide before him, its bark still scarred where time had faded two initials into one another, JR+AR. He ran a thumb along the grooves, barely visible, but still there. He didn't need the full names. They were etched elsewhere, deeper. Back at the barn, Gloria pulled Ben aside. I thought you'd want this, she said, handing him an aged newsletter folded in thirds. The paper smelled faintly of cedar and ink. On the front page, a black and white photo showed a younger Jacob beside a stream, his arm around a woman in a ranger jacket, a small tent in the background. Ben stared longer than he meant to. That's my mother, he said quietly. Gloria nodded. You were barely Ethan's age then. That evening, back at the house, Jacob spread out two maps on the dining table. One was his, hand-marked topography sheets with familiar creases, the corners worn soft. The other was printed on glossy paper, the HOA seal in the corner. Ben pulled up the county's GIS interface on his laptop. Together, father and son aligned the two sets. This trail? Ben asked, pointing. Used to stop here, Jacob replied, tapping further south. The rest was never marked. Ben frowned. They're at least 300 feet past the original access. Jacob nodded, slowly whittling the edge of a cedar shaving from a branch he'd cut that morning. The soft skrk of blade against grain was the only sound for a moment. Ben opened a separate window and layered GPS data over the HOA's trail designations. His jaw tightened. This is off. Way off. Jacob looked up. They've marked paths over land that isn't even zoned as common use, Ben continued. Some of this overlaps the western section of your old ranger zone. Jacob set the carving knife down. You remember Grace Adler? Ben squinted. The legal officer from Indihood District? She still consults on land use. Ben pushed the laptop aside. You think we'll need her? Jacob didn't answer right away. He reached for the phone still mounted to the kitchen wall, a rotary installed decades ago, kept more from sentiment than utility. He dialed from memory, one click at a time. Jacob dials Grace. It's time. Most boundaries, Grace said, tapping a dotted line, only matter when someone tries to cross them. The office smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish. Sunlight filtered through vertical blinds and landed in golden bands across a scatter of maps layered on the long oak desk. Ceramic owls peered from the bookshelf behind Grace Adler, each with its own tilt and personality, watching as she leaned forward in her chair. Jacob Reeves sat opposite her, a leather folder spread open between them. His hands moved carefully as he laid out the contents, weathered deeds, trail permits, a faded topographic overlay sketched in pencil. Grace's fingers traced the edges of a laminated ranger badge before shifting back to the map. I kept the originals, Jacob said. Didn't trust digitization to remember what mattered. Grace offered a small smile. Good instinct. She opened a ledger on her side and typed quietly, occasionally glancing at her screen. Your documents check out. The property boundaries are intact. You have clear ownership of the Southern Forest Tract and exclusive trail rights dating back to '78. Her tone remained calm, but Jacob could hear steel underneath. They have no recorded easement. No lease. Nothing. He nodded, though his jaw tightened slightly. Grace closed the folder. If they've expanded signage and trail structures into your land, that's more than presumptuous. Back in Frosted Pines, Karen's latest newsletter had already landed in mailboxes. Its subject, Forest Trail temporarily closed for safety review. The text was vague, hinting at recent incidents and pending assessments. It didn't mention property lines or citations, but a few bolded terms like shared stewardship and community responsibility felt pointed. Ben read it aloud over breakfast, folding the paper as he spoke. They're getting ahead of something, he said. Spinning their own version. Ethan poked at his scrambled eggs. Can I still go to the mossy path? Ben exchanged a look with Jacob, who sat at the end of the table, stirring cream into his coffee. Soon, Ben said gently. Later that afternoon, Jacob and Grace stopped at a roadside diner just outside Bend. The kind with checkered floors and a jukebox that still worked. A waitress named Flo brought them 2 slices of apple pie and 2 mugs of coffee without needing to ask. She didn't write anything down. You've barely changed, Grace said, slicing her pie. You still sit quiet and let people talk first. Jacob chuckled softly. Still works. Outside, the sky had softened into a pale overcast. Trucks rolled by now and then. A student changed the letters on the marquee sign with a long pole, Friday, meatloaf night, bring a friend. As Grace folded the final notice into an envelope, she glanced at Jacob's shirt pocket. Is that your old trail log? He pulled out the small notebook, its cover scuffed but intact. Picked it up again, he said. Figured if they're going to rewrite the woods, I should at least take notes. Meanwhile, in Frosted Pines, Karen met with Tom in the HOA conference room. The table was stacked with papers, plans for a fall picnic circled in red ink. If we let this go, Karen said, pressing the edge of her nail into the wood, we're admitting defeat. Tom looked unsure. But we don't have legal grounds. Not outside the common trail loop. Karen waved him off. Tradition matters. The picnic is happening. That evening, Grace sealed the envelope. Her logo, Adler Land and Easement Law, was embossed in navy. She handed it to Jacob with a pen and a nod. This isn't escalation, she said. It's a boundary. There's to respect, or not. Jacob signed. The next day, the letter arrived in the HOA Dropbox. Karen opened it in her office, brow tight, jaw tense. She scanned the lines, citations, parcel numbers, language about unauthorized trail expansion. Her mouth twisted slightly. Karen scoffs, holding the envelope, let him try. We've got tradition. You can't just buy the forest, Karen snapped. Jacob looked at her without blinking. Too late. Rain swept across the sidewalk outside the Deschutes County Records office, making a soft hiss as it touched the maples lining the lot. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly while Grace Adler signed the last page of the transfer packet. Jacob sat beside her, hat in his lap, face unreadable. The county clerk flipped through the documents, glancing occasionally between the notarized stamps and the hand-drawn boundaries highlighted in yellow. Everything's in order, the clerk said, nodding. Filed and certified as of 10:03 this morning. Congratulations. Jacob offered only a quiet thank you, but Grace smiled, sharp and professional. We'll need 3 certified copies and digital confirmation sent to my office. As they stepped outside, the wind picked up, tugging at the corners of Jacob's coat. He paused by the truck, rain misting his shoulders, and looked out toward the hills just beyond town, the same stretch of forest now bearing his name again, officially. He didn't say much during the drive back to Frosted Pines. Grace filled the silence with updates: when to expect confirmation, how to handle future boundary questions, what to do if the HOA tried anything creative. At the cabin, Jacob poured 2 mugs of coffee while Grace called the sheriff to confirm delivery of the deed map. On the porch, under the overhang, the scent of cedar hung thick in the wet air. Jacob moved slowly, setting down his mug and pulling an old canvas roll from behind the bench. Inside, wrapped in flannel, was his grandfather's axe. He ran a cloth soaked in linseed oil down the wooden handle, small motions tracing old grooves worn smooth by time. "I haven't used it in years," he said. "For what it's worth," Grace replied, "you won't need to." Word spread fast. By late afternoon, Gloria had arranged an impromptu cider gathering. Her porch glowed with strings of amber lights, and a dozen neighbors shuffled in, shaking umbrellas and clutching ceramic mugs. The cider was warm and spiced, a heavy cinnamon scent floating through the air. A basket of pumpkin scones disappeared faster than she could warm a second tray. Gloria tapped her glass with a spoon. "I suppose you've all heard," she said, eyes twinkling. "Jacob here's reclaimed the woods. Officially." There was a murmur of approval, surprise, a few whispered questions. Someone clapped softly. Sheriff Cole, standing near the steps with his hands in his pockets, simply added, "It's all legal." "I checked." Karen found out during a visit to the general store. The clerk, a college student with dyed pink hair, was taping over the HOA flyer with a poster for the harvest dance. Karen's brows lifted. "Excuse me, we have authorization to." The girl shrugged. "Owner said HOA stuff doesn't apply here anymore. Said ask Mr. Reeves if you have questions." Karen left without finishing her purchase. Tom was the first to approach Jacob the next day, hesitating at the edge of the porch, shoes damp, expression pinched. "I didn't know," he said. Jacob sipped from his thermos. "Now you do." Tom nodded slowly, then turned and left. That evening, under a brief break in the clouds, Jacob walked the trailhead and planted a new sign. He'd carved it that morning, each letter slow and deliberate. Private property, Reeves Forest Trust, no HOA access permitted. The wood was still damp when he stepped back and wiped his hands. The next morning, in her sunroom crowded with HOA folders and leftover newsletters, Karen dialed her cell, pacing. She pressed the phone tighter to her ear. "Get the permits ready. The picnic goes ahead." They set the tables with red checkered cloths and warm pulled pork, but forgot to ask the owner's permission. By midday, the clearing near the disputed trailhead was buzzing. The leaves had turned rich shades of russet and amber, crunching beneath boots and folding chairs as neighbors arrived with picnic baskets and crockpots. Children darted between hay bales stacked near the edge of the trail, their hands sticky from cider donuts. A bluegrass playlist played softly from a speaker resting on a log bench. The HOA banner hung between 2 pines, its bold serif letters proclaiming, "Maple Hollow Fall Gathering, Celebrating Tradition." Karen stood at the front near the main table, lips set and blazer buttoned tight despite the warming sun. She surveyed the crowd with satisfaction, clipboard in hand. Tom hovered near the cider table, less certain, tugging at his collar with a nervous glance toward the tree-lean. The wind stirred faintly, lifting corners of the tablecloths and sending one napkin fluttering under a bench. "Thank you all for joining us," Karen called, raising her voice over the chatter. "This land has long been a place of gathering, reflection, and shared care. Today we continue that legacy, together." Polite applause followed. Some clapped quickly, more out of habit than conviction. Near the edge of the gathering, Abigail Kerr adjusted the strap on her camera. Her lens caught everything: Karen at the podium, children threading colorful paper leaves onto twine, a line of neighbors piling food onto compostable plates. She moved quietly, cataloging expressions, especially those that faltered when they glanced toward the trail. Then Jacob and Grace arrived. They didn't announce themselves. They simply stepped onto the path, their boots brushing damp leaves. Grace wore a charcoal coat, a slim leather folder tucked under her arm. Jacob, in his forest ranger vest, paused beside a faded tree stump. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The effect rippled. Heads turned. Conversations quieted. Even the music seemed to fade behind them. Sheriff Cole appeared next, walking from the opposite direction with a rolled set of documents in his hand. His steps were measured. His face, unreadable. He approached the center of the picnic as Karen was preparing to announce the cider raffle. "Miss Holbrook," he said, voice level. "We need to address something before you continue." Karen blinked. "Sheriff, this isn't the time. We're mid-event." "I'm aware." He unrolled the papers. "This injunction was issued by the Deschutes County Court. It confirms the land you're occupying is privately owned. You were notified of this in writing 10 days ago." A hush settled, sharp and immediate. Even the children stopped moving. Karen's expression twisted. "This is a community tradition. You can't just shut down community gatherings." Grace stepped forward, cool and precise. "You received a cease and desist. Proceeding with this event constitutes willful encroachment. This is your second notice." There was no raised voice, no grandstanding. Just paperwork and facts, and the weight of truth. Someone near the cider table whispered, "Wait, is this not legal?" Tom's face had gone pale. He stepped forward reluctantly. "We were warned," he said, just loud enough to carry. Several families began packing their things, slowly, uncertain. Others stood frozen, plates in hand, looking to Karen, then to the sheriff, then back again. The spell cracked. Coolers shut. Chairs folded. A boy dropped a streamer of paper leaves. The wind picked it up and carried it toward the trees. Jacob remained still. His silence seemed heavier than any argument. Karen, chest rising and falling, turned sharply toward Abigail, who had raised her camera but hadn't clicked. "You're siding with them?" Abigail replies, "I'm siding with the truth." "You know what's louder than yelling?" Gloria said, flipping through old binders. "Paperwork." The attic above Gloria Evans' garage smelled of cedar, old fabric, and dust disturbed by memory. Faded plastic bins sat beside yellowing banker boxes, each one labeled in her sharp, looping script. A single bulb dangled from the ceiling, casting a cone of light that illuminated a stack of HOA newsletters bundled with garden twine. Jacob stood near the back, arms crossed loosely, while Ben crouched by a low shelf stacked with file folders. Gloria moved with quiet confidence, flipping open a binder labeled 2014 to 2016 expenditures. "I told them to digitize these," she said. Karen said paper was too slow. But paper doesn't forget. They found it halfway through the third binder, a reimbursement form, signed by Karen, for forest signage and community trail banners, dated 2 weeks after the cease and desist was filed. Another listed food expenses for event support, referencing the very clearing the sheriff had shut down. Ben frowned, holding a second form up to the light. "This invoice is duplicated." Gloria peered over her glasses. "They reimbursed the same expense twice. Or fabricated it." He looked at his father. "They've been funding this push with discretionary HOA money, on land that isn't theirs." Jacob didn't say much. Just nodded, once. Later that afternoon, Grace met them at her office with a blank legal pad and 2 highlighters. The folder grew thicker by the minute, clippings, financial records, conflicting minutes from board meetings. Grace's pencil tapped thoughtfully against the desk. "This is enough for a formal complaint," she said. "We'll file with the town council and the state HOA oversight board." Ben exhaled. "It's more than we hoped for." Outside, frost clung to the parked cars. The cafe down the street had updated its chalkboard sign, "Not everything worth keeping is loud." Jacob Reeves. Abigail Kerr dropped by Grace's office just before sundown. She read through the folder, silent for a full 10 minutes, then nodded and tucked a notepad into her jacket. 2 days later, Her piece ran on the front page of the Hollow Pines Gazette. When rules turn into power plays, a forest town responds. The article laid out years of trail control, unapproved signage, and a growing pattern of discretionary spending without vote. That morning, someone left a woven basket of warm cranberry muffins on Jacob's porch. No note. Just the scent of nutmeg and quiet thanks. In the HOA building, Karen read the article with a tight jaw. She swept the paper into a drawer and unlocked her phone. A new email campaign was already drafted, unmasking the forest fraud, what they're not telling you. She sent it. But replies came slower this time. Tom Wallace knocked on Jacob's cabin door just before dusk. He wore no jacket, just a worn sweater and an expression Jacob hadn't seen before, something between regret and fatigue. "I owe you an apology," Tom said. "I didn't look close enough. I let her speak for all of us." Jacob invited him in without a word. They stood in the kitchen a few minutes later, steam rising from fresh coffee. "I'd like to speak at the next HOA meeting," Tom said. "About what really happened." Jacob nodded. Later that week, the town council issued a formal bulletin. A public hearing will be held to review HOA conduct, finances, and leadership integrity. On Friday morning, as Jacob stepped out to collect the paper, he found a small envelope in the mailbox, no return address, no stamp. Inside was a folded slip of lined paper, neatly written in pen. About time someone stood up. "We're with you now." The folding chairs were full by 6. By 6:15, the silence was louder than applause. The Frosted Pines Community Center had never felt so tense. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, flickering slightly in one corner, while the space heaters along the back wall gave off a low, metallic rattle. Rows of folding chairs creaked under the weight of neighbors wrapped in fleece and wool, some clutching thermoses of coffee, others holding meeting agendas printed in small type and already creased at the corners. Karen Holbrook stood at the front beside a plywood podium, her eyes scanning the room. She dressed carefully, pale blue blouse, understated earrings, a folder clutched to her chest like a shield. When she spoke, her voice was tight but pitched for sympathy. "Community is about order," she began. "About protecting what we've built together, keeping things safe, clean, reliable. That's all I've ever tried to do. Tradition matters, even when it's not written down." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle, but the room remained still. No applause. Just the faint click of someone resealing a thermos. Grace Adler stood next. Calm and crisp in a navy blazer, she stepped forward with a manila folder in one hand and a remote in the other. A portable projector hummed to life behind her, casting its light onto the old bingo board mounted on the wall. "This," she said evenly, "is what has been written down." She clicked. A scan of the original deed filled the screen, then an annotated trail map with highlighted overlap zones. The next slide showed scanned reimbursements and check stubs labeled event costs, one dated the day after a legal warning was issued. Another showed duplicate invoices under different line items. A low murmur rippled through the back row. Abigail Kerr followed. Her slideshow displayed color photographs from the picnic, red checkered tables, HOA banners staked into private land, Karen addressing a crowd beneath a pine that had since sprouted a private property sign. Her voice never rose above a reporter's neutrality. "These are not just images," Abigail said. "They're evidence of a boundary ignored." Tom Wallace stood next. He unfolded a single sheet of paper, his fingers shaking slightly as he read. "I didn't ask questions," he said. "I didn't verify. I trusted leadership, and I was misled. I'm sorry." He stepped back without looking at Karen. Then Gloria rose, moving slowly but firmly toward the podium. She opened a worn red notebook, one the older neighbors recognized instantly, her late husband's HOA committee journal. "In 2009, she said, voice steady, Frank wrote this, be wary of good intentions without checks. That's where power slips into ownership." She flipped the page. "And here, records of discretionary fund suggestions that match exactly what we've seen this year." Chairs creaked again, but no one moved. The room held its breath. Jacob stood last. He didn't carry a folder. No slides. No prepared remarks. He simply stepped to the front, looked once around the room, and spoke in a voice as low and steady as the trees outside. "You can't lead people by cornering them," he said. "You guide them. You listen. You leave space for trust to grow." He looked down, then back up. "And when someone forgets who the land belongs to, not on paper, but in memory, it's up to the rest of us to remind them." Silence, again. But it was different this time, full, not empty. Someone in the second row whispered, "Finally." A thermos lid clicked shut. Then, one by one, people began to stand. No clapping. Just quiet rising. The vote passed without contest. Karen Holbrook was removed by majority. The existing board dissolved. An interim committee was announced: Jacob Reeves, Gloria Evans, and Mr. Delaney. The room stirred with soft murmurs of agreement. Karen gathered her things wordlessly. She moved toward the exit without turning around. No one followed. As the crowd dispersed into the chill of night, Ethan wrapped his arms around Jacob's waist, his cheek pressed against his grandfather's jacket. "So, can we hike again tomorrow?" Jacob smiled. Trails open again. The sun broke through the trees like someone lifting a curtain on the season's final act. The first frost clung to the pine needles like dusted sugar, sparkling in the slanting morning light. It was early, the kind of crisp that made breath visible and coffee essential. But the path near the trailhead buzzed gently with life. Folding tables had been set up just off the main loop, adorned with baskets of cranberry muffins and a large thermos of warm cider that steamed each time Gloria refilled a mug. The smell of cloves and cedar drifted through the clearing. A new wooden sign stood at the forest's edge, its carved letters still fresh, darkened slightly with varnish. Reeves Forest, private land conserved for public kindness. Below, a smaller plaque read, "No HOA oversight. Please tread with care, not permission." Ben adjusted the final screw at the base of the sign while Ethan crouched nearby, using a small brush to dab white paint into a leaf etching. Jacob stood behind them, hands in his coat pockets, watching in quiet pride. Children gathered beside a long bench, each receiving a small journal with a leather tie and a hand-pressed leaf glued inside the cover. Junior Ranger notes, Gloria had written on the front page in looping script. Ethan took his role seriously, leading the first walk along the inner loop. He pointed out moss patches, tree knots, and a stump that might have been here before Grandpa was born. Jacob chuckled softly at that, the sound rustling like the leaves overhead. Grace arrived mid-morning, legal folder tucked beneath one arm, the other holding a fresh copy of the conservation easement contract. She handed it to Jacob with a quiet smile. 10 years, renewable, she said. Forest can't be sold, parceled, or developed. Not even by you. I'll try not to argue, he replied, signing with a worn pen from his ranger days. Sheriff Cole dropped by in his off-duty jacket, nodding toward the cider but not pouring a cup. I don't need proof, he said, but it's nice when the paperwork matches the truth. From behind the cider table, Gloria grinned. Told you. Paperwork always wins. Tom appeared just before noon, holding a tray of warm apple fritters from the cafe. He didn't make a speech, just walked up to Jacob and offered the tray with both hands. Thank you, he said. Nothing more. Jacob nodded and took one, offering a second to Ethan, who accepted it with sticky fingers and a grin. Abigail stood off to the side, camera slung over her shoulder, notebook half filled. She approached Jacob gently. Can I ask, she began. But Jacob shook his head and handed her a pressed leaf from his journal, golden and crisp. That says enough, he said. Later, after the cider had been poured, blankets folded, and the last of the muffins shared, Jacob wandered back to the old pine just off the loop. The bark still bore the faded carving, JR+AR, softened now by weather and years. He sat on a flat rock nearby and resumed whittling the edge of a new walking stick. The wind carried the quiet laughter of children and the low murmur of parents thanking Gloria for cider refills. Ethan trotted back from the trail, dirt on his boots and a triumphant look in his eyes. He held a handmade signpost in both hands, a narrow board with simple block letters painted in his careful handwriting. He pressed it into the soft ground just beside the main path. "Thank you, Grandpa." Jacob paused, knife resting on the stick, and gave a slow nod. He didn't speak. The wind picked up, gentle but full, stirring the trees in a rustle like applause. The sun reached across the canopy, warming the edges of the woods. At the far end of the path, just beyond the curve of the clearing, a figure appeared, a young woman in a green jacket and hiking boots. She approached slowly, stopping at the new sign. Her fingers brushed the wood, tracing the letters. She didn't move on immediately. Instead, she read every word. And then she smiled. The frost had barely melted when the first boots touched the trail again, not with protest, but with quiet gratitude. In the hush that followed justice, laughter returned to the woods, and old hands passed warm cider with new purpose. Sometimes, all it takes is one steady voice and a few honest pages to remind a community what fairness sounds like. When rules are used for power, they divide, but when rooted in kindness, they guide. Maybe the path to healing isn't paved, just marked by the courage to say, "This far, no farther."